All right, so everything is out from being boiled. And let's take a look at the metal that's left. Well, not the metal that's left, but the finish that's left. So you can see some around here of the original bluing that was still left under there. It's pretty well worn where the hammers were. But the hammers themselves aren't bad. Just a little pitting up underneath, but you can still see some color that's there. And we have the same assembly marks, the V with the 3 lines. So a lot of this is present on just about every piece. I can see them down here. Some of these smaller parts like the sear, they would have them on there. The springs may not. Underneath here, there's a little that was left on that side. And there were some that were here. The wood also had it on the inside. You can kind of see it right there. So this is all the same parts and pieces that correlate with the numbers that were on the barrel. So the barrel's actually turned out pretty nice. Even though this is Damascus steel, you can kind of see some of the coloring there. The boiling doesn't really bring all of this stuff off. You would have to wire wheel this to get anywhere near seeing that all the striations in the metal. But we're not going to do that. This gun is just not worth going that far with. Down here was in really good shape, but the top part of the barrels started to get a little banged up. We got to clean the insides out as well. But the top rib is nice. There is a little crack right here. We're going to leave that though, since this is not being fired, being black powder. Percussion nipples turned out pretty decent, but all this discoloration is from all that mercury that's in those primers going off year after year. But that's how the metal looks coming out from being boiled for about a half an hour. And then I just carted everything off and they're oiled right now. So now the main focus will be back towards this wood. I'm going to clean up all these edges now, meaning I'm going to scrape and file and chip away all this glue that's there. And we're going to replace that glue with resin. But I'm going to start with this piece, clean up the edge down here, and then glue these ears back together on top. And then we got to find a better way to jump into this guy here. So we'll come up with a plan, and then we'll come back into it and see what that plan looks like. All right, to get started on this wood, I mixed up my Acroglass and I let it sit for about 10 minutes before I started working with it. I want it to be somewhat more congealed than runny. So we had a major crack coming through this way. And it's hard to put this on through camera, but I still have a screw that was in here holding this piece here. And there's another screw here coming in holding it to that side. Once this glass sets, the screws are going to be hidden underneath all of this stuff. So it's on pretty thick. There was a big chunk missing here. And I'm going to turn the wood on its side this way so that it'll set. But it's not running all over the place. So you can see we tried to fill a screw hole here. And the crack went all the way through on the other side. But it's pretty much like a jelly kind of consistency right now. So it's just sitting there. So I'm going to turn this on its side a little bit so that this big gap right here will try to just not run down the side of it. But it's easier to sand this down after than to try to come back and put layer. So I let it get a little bit of a jelly consistency and let it sit on there. But before I did that, I had another setup that was really runny, so it would get down into all these little cracks that are all through here. They're just zigzagged everywhere. So that more of a liquid consistency got down into there, and then the rest of it I let set to get to that jelly consistency and put it down over the top. So you'll see it's starting to run down a little bit, so we'll try to pull it back up, mound it, and just let it sit there for a little while. So we didn't work on the big piece that comes from the bottom. We didn't do that yet because we got to still clean up that area, but I can't touch that area because everything's basically falling apart. So this is going to shore it up and give me a skeleton to work from, and then we'll start to clean up that wood piece on the other side and figure out another plan on how to attach it. So this is step one of the plan. Kind of shore up and give it a skeleton, and then when this hardens, then we have something that we can work from on the other side. All right, we'll come back and take a look at that. So while the glue is drying on that wood sitting over there to the side, we're going to address these barrels. The inside is very, very rusty and filled with all kinds of whatever you can imagine. So after the boiling process, there's obviously rust and everything that's been converted inside, as well as all the fouling and whatever else was in there, spider poop. What I have done in the past that seems to work pretty well, I wouldn't do this on a new rifled barrel, but you can take your brass brush, put it on a long stem, and stick it in the end of a drill, and use the drill's power to kind of break up everything that's inside. Now, we're not going to go extremely rough with this. You're not pushing this all the way to the back. What I do is just go real slow. If we can get everything to lock in tight. And just turn slowly. This doesn't want to grab here. I might have to take a length off this. So you just use whatever brass rods you got laying around. Doesn't need to be anything special or particular. Just going slow, in and out with it. And it's just like a karting wheel that we were doing on the outside. You should see all this dust and crud come out. Which isn't bad. Now you can do this back and forth as many times as you need to until you look in there and see that everything's pretty much the way that you want it to be. After this is done, we're going to dump oil on a mop and run the mop in and out just to preserve the insides. And that's kind of all you do for the inside of these old shotgun barrels. There's really not a whole lot else you can do getting in there, unless you want to continuously boil, which we're not going to do with this particular gun. It just doesn't need it. The other thing you can do is get to the back end of the breech, and if you can, there's plugs, you can unscrew them. I don't recommend doing that because they're basically frozen in place and you'll end up breaking something. So just run your homemade drill here right through the inside, and that'll clean everything up the way that you want it to be. All right, we're back here after a lot of acrylic glass has set. So I want to show you what it looks like. We had a massive crack going through here, and we had the broken wrist up on top. There is a lot of glue or glass that is down inside of all of this. I've almost filled it basically. So the reason by putting so much on in several different applications is I want that to permeate down into all of these major cracks. That's where the strength is going to come from. I mean, there's so much down in there. They're basically filled. There was like a 1/4 inch gap between wood pieces. It's all filled with this. And it's all been pressed together. Now I put that screw back in to hold that top piece on, but you'll see there's so much built up here. So as we start to sand all of this down with sandpaper and a couple small chisels, we'll get the height of the different variations of the wood here to match, and we'll blend it as best we can. Then I'll come back in with a small little checkered roller, and we'll try to refill in some of that checkering a little bit into the glass that's there. We're going to do our best to get the shape back at least. It's never going to be whole again, but it's going to look a heck of a lot better, and it will be able to be hung up for a long time. This gun is obviously not going to be shot. It's just going to get hung. But all these cracks are filled, and they're really, really strong. So I'm going to start sanding this now. I'm going to start with a 100 grit and then move to a 220 grit. And then as all of this starts to polish down, then we'll switch over to higher. We'll go to 400, 600, and then 1,000. And we'll do the rest of this wood with 2,000 just to smooth it out a little bit, but not really take a lot of material away. So I'm going to start just sanding these areas with the 100 and then finish it off once I get lower with the 220, and then we'll come back and do everything together with those finer grits going up and up and up. And we'll take some pictures here of progress along the way so you can see it. But we're not going to bore you by sitting here and sanding and sanding and sanding away. So we'll come back with some images here, and then the final step will be putting some of these metal parts back in and fitting them, because there might still be some high spots of glue on the inside, and we'll use a small little Dremel tool and we'll just kind of chisel that stuff away a little bit until everything fits nice and perfectly in there, and we'll get back to it from there. All right, coming back in here after sanding. Ugh. So we used many different sheets to go through all this. So now the wood is very smooth and everything is evened out. And when we look into our big cracked areas, it's all filled. So we tried to get our checkering to match up as best that we could when we glued everything back together and held it in place. We do still see some of our screws present there, but those were put in by someone else before, and they are acting as a really good mechanical connection point right there. So I left those two, but the other ones I took out and I replaced with wooden dowels. But they're hidden by the glue. So underneath that glue, there's a wooden dowel that's under there, but it's glued over. There's a big chunk that was missing there. So we just had to try to polish that down, and I got to polish a little bit more. But I'm going to use my chisels and square that off so that the trigger guard tang can fit into there. And then I'm going to come back over this very lightly, the checkering here, with the checker wheel. Just very lightly. There's not much you can do to save that. It is what it is at this point. But this is all filled. Again, this is just going to be a wall hanger. This isn't going to be fired. If this was going to be fired, we would have had to do something much more structural inside of here. Running screws this way, hidden inside the wood, and we would have had to put pins down through everything here to hold it together. And we're just not going to do that. It's filled with glass, and it's structurally sound to hang. So the next step here is we are going to stain all of this wood and let it dry. So there was a massive gap that was right down through here, and that's all filled with glass now, but our holes are still perfect through everything, so we can put our pins back through. And this stock was cracked pretty bad back through here, but there is a mechanical pin or screw or something that's down through the top. I didn't touch it as I was sanding everything. But I left a butt plate on to sand this. And the reason why is I didn't want to round the edge off. The wood has already shrunk a little bit down here. So if I had that butt plate off and was sanding to the end, I would have rounded that edge and it would have looked even worse. So I left it on, but came right up to it. So it's still really nice and flat right to it, with just a little bit of a gap down there. So that's where we're leaving off here. And we're going to stain this and then put everything back on it and see how it comes out. But this is a very cheap way to repair major cracks like this. But there's only so much you can do. And being 150 plus years old, she's going to look a little better. All right, let's stain it and come back and see what it looks like. All right, so we got everything stained and it's dried and soaked in. I got everything chipped away on the outside. I've been fitting these guys in with these little chisels. So the bottom piece is in there, but you can still see there's some pretty significant gaps. And because this is going to be hung, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pack some gauze down into the bottom, very bottom, and then I'll mix up some more glass and just let it gel before I put it in there, because I don't want it running all the way through everything. But if it's gelled, it can sit into here, and then I can just lightly polish some away to get that fill, because I don't want a big giant gap there. So I will fill those. But it's time to put these things back in here and see exactly how well that they do fit. So these have to be in at least the half cock position. That compresses the spring down. And they should just sit in there. Give them just a little tap to seat, because everything is kind of cut and shaped for them to be there. And make sure our triggers are forward. And it's just gonna kind of find its way. As we put the screw in here, it should seat itself. There it goes. Everything just kind of fits in there very snug. We got to make sure the triggers are forward so that the sears can fit in there. The half cock also brings that sear up, so it can sit above that trigger. And they just need little gentle taps to find their way in there. All that glass is just cut out of the way, trimmed so that these sit in there nice and snug. So hopefully this screw will pick up the other side and pull the plates together. Yep, looks like we grabbed it. This is where we don't over tighten. So we want to see that come to almost be as flush as possible, but it may not. See, we still got a big gap here. So we could fill this with that gelled glass too, just a little bit around the outside. And there's a little bit more around this side as well. I won't worry about up here as much. But let's see how these barrels sit in. Actually, before we do that, we need the barrel locking plate to go in. See if we can get this to find its way down through there. Grab. There might be a little debris in the way of that. Yeah, we'll have to clean that hole up. It's just not lining up as well as it should. Let's see if this one found its way through. This one's not the right screw for this, but we'll see if it can make its way in. It seems to be going down. Its way in. I won't tighten it all the way. We want to see if we can get this one to line up to a little bit more of an angle. No, we'll have to see if we can bend something to work. These plates may have shifted, but for now we can at least see how these barrels lock in. And I do line up with this pin. That is holding them together. Obviously, we're still pretty gapped. This wood was really blown apart in a bad way. Let's see if we can let the hammers down. That works. So I'm going to make up some more glass, let it gel, and then I'll slowly pack it down into here and then resand it a little bit. I got to see if I can get something in there and pull the back plate to align and then drop this in, because this screw is in pretty rough shape. It's not exactly straight, so we got to line some things up so that it will find its way. But it's looking pretty good. We're just about there. It's come a long way from being blown apart into several different pieces here, that if it was to hang up, and we can cover up these screw heads a little bit more, but if that was to hang from 10 feet away, it wouldn't look like the stock was broken into 20 different pieces. It definitely is back together and at least straight, so we can get the overall look of this and at least keep it for other generations to enjoy what it looks like. So I'm going to make that gel now, and then you'll come back and take a look at how it all is. All right, so everything is done. I'll bring you back in here and see the final setting of what this little bit of glass filled in around the backside here. Filled in just a little bit more. I really didn't want to go too heavy and glob up, because this stuff will just kind of spread all over the place and not look the way I wanted to. Obviously, this is a lot bigger of a gap than we should have been dealing with, but it's full. The lock plates are secure. Again, this is just going to be hung, so it should look nice when it's hanging up. You know, you'd have a distance of back here, so you don't necessarily see it as much. But on the bottom, those were quite large. Those are filled in. I mean, yeah, that's going to look a little off and goopy, but it kind of is what it is for what we can do to try to fill this in. All this wood was gone. But when you see where the crack lines were, those are somewhat clean. Cleaner, I guess you could say. We filled in a little bit more back here where it was really emptied or void of wood. I mean, our crack lines are dark, but they're even with the rest of the wood. So it kind of looks a lot worse than it feels, but at least everything is together. And it's very strong. I mean, the crack lines up here where those little screws are holding everything together, they're clean and full. Remember, this wood was in like 10 pieces. So for it to be all back together the way that it is impressive by itself. But it's just going to hang, so it's not going to be used. If this was to be used, I don't think we'd be able to save that wood. We'd have to take that wood away, cut new wood, and splice it in there. Everything here turned out very well. I do like the color that this wood came up with. I obviously sanded everything down pretty heavily to get all the other dents and cracks to match. And that's just one pass of stain. And then I used toilet bowl ring wax and waxed over it after the stain was dry. And that kind of waterproofs it and keeps that stain and oil inside, so that as it's hung, it won't dry out or dry out as quickly. Barrels came out very nice. This is Damascus steel. There were no extra markings that popped up. The only ones that did were small, and right there, little HK and 15. It's really hard for that to pick up. But that's acrid glass and how well it works. And it's another one done. And we're moving on to the next. Actually, we just had another project that came in, broken toe on a shotgun. So we cut a piece of wood, staked it on, acrid glassed it on, and then sanded it down to match that. Obviously, there's a dark line there, but the stock was kind of rare. It's off a Browning A5, and the guy didn't want to spend $500 for another one, and he wanted that repaired. So we're getting a little better at the woodwork. Blended nicely at the toe, but unfortunately it still has that big thick black line there. See if we can sand that maybe a little bit more and try to make that black line a little less visible, but it's kind of hard to get there. I mean, it was a big piece. It was an odd crack. But that's what acrid glass can do. That's the material. That's what you get from Brownells. This stuff works amazing. All right, that's all for now. Once we get something more unique, we'll come back to you. All right, take care, everybody.